Attention all grill masters and backyard barbecue enthusiasts. Lynn's has everything you need to make your 4th of July cookout a success. From sizzling certified Angus beef steaks and mouth-watering burgers to fresh-cut fruit and all the condiments you desire, we have you covered. Browse our weekly ad for celebratory savings like 39 cents per pound seedless watermelon through July 4th and shop online at lynsgrocery.com for extra convenience. Lynn's, where delicious begins.
This episode was first published on August 17th, 2023. Oppenheimer, dropping the bomb.
Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
Beneath that sinister pall of smoke, the world's most destructive force has been unleashed.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT.
Yet in the image of a mushroom cloud that rose into these skies, we are most starkly reminded of humanity's core contradiction, how the very spark that marks us as a species, our thoughts, our imagination, our language, our tool-making, our ability to set ourselves apart from nature and bend it to our will. Those very things also give us the capacity for unmatched destruction.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Could the United States have won the war in the Pacific without dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? This remains one of the most trying questions to emerge from the good war. Because of what happened in early August 1945, about 120,000 people killed in the immediate blasts, and what came after, a massive arms race and Cold War, among whose legacies are the more than 12,000 nuclear warheads in the world today. And it's one of the historical debates raised in the blockbuster film Oppenheimer. And that's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
I don't know if we can be trusted with such a weapon, but I know the Nazis can't.
You can convince anyone of anything, even yourself.
Hitler's dead, but the Japanese fight on.
The place where we should focus our moral attention is not simply on this piece of enormously destructive technology called nuclear bombs, but on this whole idea of strategic bombing that makes civilians legitimate targets.
18 days before Adolf Hitler, trapped in his bunker below Berlin, committed suicide, the man who had led America through depression and war, Franklin Roosevelt, died on April 12, 1945. 4 days later, his successor informed the world the United States would not traffic with the breakers of the peace on the terms of the peace.
So that there can be no possible misunderstanding, both Germany and Japan can be certain, beyond any shadow of a doubt, that America will continue the fight for freedom until no vestige of resistance remains. We are deeply conscious of the fact that much hard fighting is still ahead of us. Having to pay such a heavy price to make complete victory certain, America will never become a party to any plan for partial victory. To settle for merely another temporary respite would surely jeopardize the future security of all the world. Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
And just under 4 months later, President Harry Truman delivered another, even greater, historic announcement.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. The Japanese began the war from the air at Pearl Harbor. They have been repaid many-fold, and the end is not yet. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction to supplement the growing power of our armed forces. In their present form, these bombs are now in production, and even more powerful forms are in development.
Hiroshima, flattened on August 6th. Nagasaki on August 9th. 6 days later, Emperor Hirohito's broadcast announcing surrender was heard via radio all over Japan. The question of whether it was necessary to cross the atomic threshold to end the war has been with us ever since. You could say it was even there before August 1945. In July, when General Eisenhower learned of the existence of the bomb while at the Potsdam Conference, he told Secretary of War Stimson he thought using it unnecessary because, as quoted on page 301 of American Prometheus, the book upon which Christopher Nolan's Oppenheimer is based, because the Japanese were ready to surrender and it wasn't necessary to hit them with that awful thing, the words of Dwight Eisenhower. The decision to drop the bomb is condensed into a single scene in Nolan's brilliant film. Stimson is chairing a meeting of the Interim Committee. The March firebombing of Tokyo is mentioned. It killed 100,000 people. Would this new weapon kill more? The idea of doing a demonstration explosion to scare the Japanese is shot down, no pun intended. Oppenheimer, who sat in this meeting, opposed that idea. He did not oppose the immediate use of the A-bomb on civilians to end the war, and possibly all future wars, as he expressed in a speech to the American Philosophical Society in November 1945.
Atomic weapons were actually made by scientists. Even some of you may think by scientists normally committed to the exploration of rather recondite things. The speed of the development, the active and essential participation of men of science in the development, have no doubt contributed greatly to our awareness of the crisis that faces us, even to our sense of responsibility for its resolution.
So back to August. Despite month after month of U.S. bombing, the Japanese still had 2 million men under arms in the home islands. The invasion of Kyushu is scheduled for November at the earliest, the invasion of Honshu for the following spring. So question number one, why not wait? Eisenhower was not the only important figure who thought the Japanese were close to quitting. But were they? The militarists who dominated decision-making in Tokyo were absolutely opposed to surrender. They made that clear. So even if Truman agreed to clearly alter the terms of surrender to, say, allow the maintenance of the emperor in the Potsdam Declaration, it's not certain the militarists would have accepted. And you can also turn that question around. Once the A-bomb is ready, why wait? Why wait for who knows how long for Japan to buckle under its own exhaustion, when with a single airplane, a decisive end to the war is now possible, so the argument goes. And you see this argument in the movie. But you don't see any Japanese. Nolan chose to tell this story strictly through Oppenheimer's eyes. And Oppie was not in the Pacific. He was in the New Mexico desert. One wonders what the audience reaction might have been had Nolan dwelt on the horrendous suffering of the thousands of Japanese who died from radiation poisoning after the bombings. Because there is something else at work here. U.S. victory in the war, the onset of the American century, holds a special place in our cultural memory. It was the good war. We were the good guys who beat the Nazis and avenged Pearl Harbor. So reckoning with atrocities, if you consider dropping an A-bomb on civilians an atrocity, complicates things. Some historians who argue the war could have ended without dropping the bomb question the high-end estimates of how many GIs would have been killed or wounded invading the Japanese home islands. Some estimates were relatively low, in the tens of thousands rather than the often cited 500,000 or 1 million, meaning an amphibious assault would not have turned into another Okinawa from one end of Japan to the other. But no one can say this with any amount of certainty. Barring internal Japanese collapse, an invasion would have been costly. And I should also mention the atomic diplomacy thesis, which says the Truman administration rushed to drop the bomb in August because it was desperate to avoid a massive Soviet military presence in the Far East, on top of concerns about what the Soviets were up to in Eastern Europe. As David M. Kennedy writes in his remarkable overview of the Great Depression and the war, Freedom from Fear, page 843, A loss of American interest in the Soviet declaration of war scarcely amounts to a calculated strategy for using the bomb as an instrument of diplomacy against the Soviets or for accelerating the scheduled drops on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. American policy regarding the relation of the bomb to the Russian presence in Asia remained uncoordinated and episodic. And then there are the moral dimensions. It was wrong to drop an atomic bomb on civilians, period. But moral or ethical questions did not weigh on the key decision makers during those fraught days 78 Augusts ago. Stanford's David M. Kennedy is one of my favorite historians. His work has profoundly influenced my understanding of American life, and he is the author of the aforementioned Freedom from Fear, which won the Pulitzer Prize, part of the Oxford History of the United States series. Its final chapter, titled Endgame, informed my questions for this episode. Writes Kennedy on page 845, the Potsdam Proclamation was about to carry the United States across a forbidding military threshold, one that marked the opening of a new chapter in the history of warfare and diplomacy. But by August 1945, the atomic bombs hardly represented a moral novelty. The moral rules that had once stayed men's hands from taking up weapons of mass destruction against non-combatants had long since been violently breached in World War II. First in the aerial attacks on European cities, then even more wantonly in the systematic firebombing of Japan. So, David Kennedy, when people look back on Hiroshima and Nagasaki today, and I'll mention that Nagasaki hardly gets a mention in the movie Oppenheimer, they might focus first on the moral, ethical implications of killing so many civilians with an atomic bomb. As FDR called the bombing of civilians inhuman barbarism in 1939. But were moral considerations especially important in 1945 at the highest levels of the U.S. government?
I think when you qualify the question by saying at the highest levels of the U.S. or British, for that matter, government, the answer is, I'm afraid to say, no. There were people who had moral qualms about working on the bomb in the first place and about using it against civilians, which was its clear purpose from the outset. But their opinions really never reached the highest level of decision-making. The moral dimension of it comes into prominence after the fact, you might say, when a lot of guilty consciences are awakened. But in the actual process of developing the weapon and using it, those kinds of considerations were far into the background, if articulated at all.
One of your most trenchant observations or insights is that if we're going to talk about the morality of what was called area bombing or terror bombing, we can't start in August of 1945. We need to begin in March of 1945 or even before that. March 9th and 10th, 300 plus B-29 aircraft killed 100,000 people in Tokyo in a firebombing that burned down much of the city. So talk about this moral Rubicon that the Allies had already crossed, which we really have to take into account when we're talking about this decision.
Well, I do think that's an important way to think about this, is in the general context of the war and the development of a form of warfare known to us as strategic bombing. And the concept of strategic bombing was first articulated in a book by an Italian war theorist named Giulio Douay. Despite the French sound of his name, he was Italian. And it's early 1920s. It's called The Command of the Air. And strategists in all major countries thinking about their grand strategy in the event of another conflict read that book carefully. Only two societies or countries, nations, fully adopted Giulio Douay's ideas about how to wage war. And those two countries were, as it happens, the United Kingdom and the United States. And you're absolutely right. When the war broke out in 1939 and there were German bombings of Polish cities and later London and British cities, Franklin Roosevelt loudly condemned, publicly condemned the bombing of civilian targets as contrary to the rules of the accepted rules of warfare and immoral in all of its aspects. Nonetheless, the United States made a decision in the early 1930s, before the war, long before the war had begun, that in the event of a future conflict, the United States would commit to building a major strategic air arm. Now, strategic air power is a particular form of air power. Its logic is to attack the enemy homeland, cripple his industries, and terrorize his populations. Douay was explicit about this. This was one of the the objectives of strategic air warfare. It's true the Germans bombed civilian cities, so did the Japanese, so did the Russians for that matter. But the only two powers that really decided to make the strategic air arm one of the principal arms that they mobilized were the British and the Americans. Early on in the conflict, the British were trying to bomb inside Germany, but the losses to their air arm were so great, they decided they could no longer bomb specifically accurately on military targets. They had to bomb at night at what was called saturation bombing. They would simply dump their loads over big urban areas and come what may, because they couldn't tolerate the losses they suffered in daylight bombing. The Americans in the European theater tried to avoid that as much as they could and tried to hew to the doctrine of bombing only military targets inside Germany in the daylight with precision, accuracy, and so on. But even in the European theater, by February of 1945, Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, authorized attacks on civilian targets simply for their psychological impact. So there was an attack on Berlin in February of 1945 that had no particular constraints on where the bombs were dropped. It was to try to shock the Germans in this late stage of the war into finally throwing in the towel. About 25,000 civilians were killed in one night in Berlin in February of 1945. In the Pacific theater, by that time, as you put it so well, the moral Rubicon had already been crossed. By the time the Allies in this case meant the United States just about exclusively, they had the long-distance bomber, the B-29, based in the Mariana Islands, and it was possible to bomb Japanese cities and the Japanese homeland regularly and routinely. And they started doing that in late 1944, all through the first part of 1945, night after night after night. These enormous bomber fleets would take off from American bases and firebomb Japanese cities. And you're absolutely right. There was one raid on Tokyo in March of 1945 that in one single night killed over 100,000 civilians. This is months before the atomic weapons were available and were used. So the debate over the use of the atomic bomb is an important debate. And it's one that I think we can take some lessons from history about it and examine our consciences about that matter. But focusing only on the atomic bombs, it seems to me, is the wrong place to focus the debate. The debate really should be about the legitimacy of making civilians legitimate targets of war. And the United States, and the Brits for that matter, had crossed that threshold months, if not years earlier.
And this is what I have trouble reconciling, because these bombing raids were meant to hasten the end of the war. The atomic bombs were meant to hasten the end of the war. And you could say, well, they did, because the Japanese did surrender after the second one. But at the same time, did not weaken the Japanese military, because it still had 2 million men under arms as of August of 1945. It's notable that after Hiroshima was leveled, Japanese people in Tokyo were able to take the train, the rail line, down to Hiroshima to see if their relatives had survived, meaning that the railroad was still intact even after all this bombing. I mean, what do you make of that difficulty?
Well, again, the strategic decision was made. And if you're looking for leverage to try to strengthen the hand of what we knew was the peace party in the Tokyo government, the greatest shock that could be administered would be, it was considered to be, the way to strengthen the hand of that party and compel the end of the conflict. But right down to the last minute, there were powerful and influential elements in the Japanese government, particularly military people, who did not want to surrender. They wanted to await the American invasion of the home islands and inflict such heavy damages on the invading forces that the Americans would negotiate certain terms of surrender. And there was a long list of them. Some people wanted to retain the Japanese conquests on the Chinese mainland. Others wanted to disarm their own troops and not surrender directly to the opposing forces. They wanted guarantees there would be no post-war trials of so-called war criminals. They did not want occupying forces to be in Japan for any length of time. So there were all kinds of things that were absolutely unacceptable to the other side. Certain factions, powerful factions in the Japanese government, were still holding out for, right down to August 9th in the Nagasaki attack in 1945.
Yeah, the militarists were in charge. We're going to return to that in a moment. I guess firebombing, or the technology that was available at the time, was not effective against the military, is what I'm saying. There were 2 million Japanese men still under arms. Well, how could that be after all these months of bombing? I'll just share an anecdote here from another book, Cultures of War by John Dower, a really great book. November 15th, 1941. Then Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall briefed 7 senior journalists in Washington about dispatching B-17s to the Philippines. He said, "If war with the Japanese does come, we'll fight mercilessly. Flying fortresses will be dispatched immediately to set the paper cities of Japan on fire. There won't be any hesitation about bombing civilians. It'll be all out." That was George Marshall.
Yeah, and that's 4 years before the atomic bomb. So again, it's a reminder that the place where we should focus our moral attention is not simply on this piece of enormously destructive technology called nuclear bombs, but on this whole idea of strategic bombing that makes civilians legitimate targets. You know, you remind me of something else, Martin. Many of your listeners maybe have seen the film now, it's several years old, called The Fog of War. It takes the form of a long hour-and-a-half interview with Robert McNamara. Of course, he was Secretary of Defense in the Vietnam War era, and most of the film is about that. But fewer people know that McNamara was out there in the Marianas in World War II on the staff of Curtis LeMay, who was directing the firebombing campaigns against the Japanese cities. And there's this, to me, powerfully touching movie in that film where McNamara leans into the camera and says to the interviewer, he says, you know, one night, and McNamara's job was to head teams that were trying to figure out the best combination of fire bombs and high explosive bombs and the best timing, the best altitude of the drop and so on to inflict maximum damage on these Japanese cities. So there's a moment in the film when McNamara leans into the interviewer, the camera, and he tells this little anecdote about one night he and LeMay were sitting together, and LeMay said to McNamara, he said, you know, McNamara, if we lose this war, you and I will be tried as war criminals because what we're doing has no precedent in the history of warfare and is certainly not legitimated by any of the agreed principles of warfare according to international standards such as they are. And McNamara says, and he was right. What we were doing had no moral justification. Now, they're talking about the firebombing. They're not talking about nuclear weapons.
In order to win a war, should you kill 100,000 people in one night by firebombing or any other way? LeMay's answer would be clearly yes. McNamara, do you mean to say that instead of killing 100,000, burning to death 100,000 Japanese civilians in that one night, we should have burned to death a lesser number or none, and then had our soldiers cross the beaches in Tokyo and been slaughtered in the tens of thousands? Is that what you're proposing? Is that moral? Is that wise? Why was it necessary to drop the nuclear bomb if LeMay was burning up Japan? And he went on from Tokyo to firebomb other cities.
So there it is. People knew that this was morally dubious territory and that the nuclear weapons are, in a sense, just another technology to advance this way of fighting the war. But they're not the place where our moral attention should be originally focused.
Page 845 of Freedom from Fear. And yes, I just indicated that it is a rather long book, but worth every page. You quote Curtis LeMay, "I tell you what war is about. You've got to kill people, and when you've killed enough of them, they stop fighting."
That's morally callous, but it's a pretty iron logic of warfare.
Yeah. So why Hiroshima? We know that the president of Harvard, James Conant, was on the interim committee. Stimson, Secretary of War, was the chair of this committee, and it was Conant who helped pick Hiroshima in the end. How did they come up with Hiroshima?
Well, again, as I understand it, the eligible or candidate targets had to have at least some minimal military justification. They couldn't be purely civilian targets. That was among the reasons why Kyoto was ruled out as a target. But there are also other, again, more morally arguable considerations, that they wanted to reserve targets like Kyoto, which did not have military significance, but had a lot of cultural and historical and human significance, reserve those for later in case the first round of attacks on the first few cities did not compel surrender. You know, the fact is that Stimson intervened, as I understand it, specifically to spare Kyoto in the first round. But there was every assumption that if the first 1 or 2 bombs or 3 bombs, they had a third one ready to go within weeks. If that didn't do the trick, they were prepared to keep going. The rate of production of new weapons, Leslie Groves estimated at 2 per month starting in September of 1945. And again, the assumption was we'll use as many of these bombs as it takes to get the desired result, which is to compel the Japanese to surrender. If the war had gone on, there's every possibility that Kyoto itself maybe even could have been bombed. There's another consideration in the background, too, which has to do with the months-long firebombing campaign that preceded August 6th and August 9th, and that is many Japanese cities were already all but totally destroyed. So they were not appropriate targets because in the aftermath of an atomic bombing, you couldn't show easily that this weapon was as powerful as it was supposed to be, because they were, as Churchill once said in another context, they would be bombing the rubble.
And they use some euphemisms to justify to themselves that Hiroshima had some minimal military value to the Japanese. But at that point, the Japanese were defeated, but they had not surrendered. This is something that Eisenhower was aware of, or at least he believed so, when he found out about the atomic bomb at Potsdam in late July of 1945. In May, Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy urged Stimson to drop the term unconditional surrender from the U.S. demands. Assistant Secretary of State Joseph Grew felt the same way, even told Truman about it. So if we're going to get into the debate over whether the war could have been ended a different way, one possible way was to alter the conditions. Will allow you to keep the emperor and the monarchy. Maybe that would have persuaded the Japanese to give in rather than face atomic devastation. What do you make of that debate, and why, in the end, Truman and Burns decided not to tweak unconditional surrender?
That's a much more difficult question to answer, because in the end, quietly, MacArthur, as the head of the occupation forces, did allow the institution of the emperor to continue. They kept the emperor, at least titularly and nominally, in place. So why didn't we do that publicly earlier, and would that have turned the trick? Again, I'm not competent to answer that question. I don't think anybody is. Actually, it's one of the great puzzles of the whole matter. People who know more about the character and nature of the Japanese governance system, no more than I do, will tell you that up until the last minute in mid-August 1945, the conventional wisdom was the emperor actually did not have much influence in the Japanese government, that he was a kind of a figurehead and he had to be deferred to, but the real decision-making apparatus was elsewhere. So that in a sense, people could have legitimately thought that guaranteeing the continuity of the imperial system and the emperor's person might not have been very consequential, because that's not where the decision-making power was. Now, as it happens, keeping the emperor in place, we think, did a lot to reconcile the Japanese people to the defeat they had to suffer, so that the emperor proved useful in the longer-term rehabilitation or reconstruction of Japan. But again, that was an arguably dubious proposition as of 1 August 1945.
I often hear today that had the U.S. invaded the Japanese home islands, starting with Kyushu in November, right? And then Honshu in March, the casualties would have been even more than had died in the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But it's hard to find a precise estimate. There were different estimates that were coming in at different times. But it's safe to say, though, that any invasion would have been bloody.
Well, that's right. This is another very deep controversial area. In the record, you find the same people on the same day in conferences in Washington, D.C., giving different estimates of what they thought the casualty figures would look like. So there was a lot of guesswork in it, but a couple of things do stick in the historical record, not least of all the Battle of Okinawa in the spring of 1945, when the resistance of the Japanese forces on Okinawa was nothing less than fanatical. Whole units would die to the last man before they would put up the white flag. So there was good reason to believe that the invasion of the home islands would meet even more ferocious resistance than had been encountered on Okinawa. The Allied, that is, again, American losses on Okinawa, were greater than D-Day in Normandy. And you touch on another point, again, which is often overlooked or misunderstood. But it's possible to argue that the atomic bombings ending the war as they did in mid-August 1945 not only saved American lives, but on net saved Japanese lives. Because if there had been the amphibious invasions in November and March of 1945, 1946, and the Japanese had resisted the way they had on Okinawa, that it's arguable that several 100,000 Japanese lives would have been lost as well. I had a personal encounter with that matter some many years ago when I was on a trip to the South Pacific, to Guadalcanal and the so-called slot down there in the Southwest Pacific, where World War II began for American forces. And a member of our group had contact with a Japanese person of his age. Both were World War II veterans. And my traveling companion shared with me a letter he later received from his Japanese friend. It's a very touching letter where he thanks the Americans for dropping the bombs. Now get this, this is a Japanese soldier, airman, thanking the Americans for dropping the bombs. Why? Because he was being trained as a kamikaze pilot, and it was his schedule to fly the next week. And when the war ended, he was grounded, no more fighting for him. So he's one life, to be sure, that was certainly spared by the fact that the war ended on a date certain. But you can extrapolate that particular singular example, it seems to me, to the much larger Japanese population. And you're looking at a situation where, ironically and oddly enough, the fact that the bombs ended the war by mid-August 1945 did not only spare American lives, but also Japanese lives.
There's another road not taken here. If we're trying to figure out a way the war might have ended without crossing the threshold into atomic warfare, and that other road would be to wait the Japanese out. But as you put it in your book here, you talk about a meeting in 1944, September, between Churchill and FDR. They say that the new atomic weapon, if available in time, might perhaps, after mature consideration, might be used against the Japanese, who should be warned that this bombardment will be repeated until they surrender. But you go on to say the deliberate mood of that now distant autumn had long since given way to the frantic tempo of the war's last spring. Amidst the gathering clamor to end the bloodshed in the chaotic circumstances of Truman's sudden ascension to the presidency, mature consideration proved chimerical. History had its own momentum, and it tolerated no delay. It doesn't seem that wait out the Japanese was really an option that anyone took seriously.
No, I mean, by that stage of the game, any strategic concept that prolonged the conflict had little chance of really getting an audience. And again, you touch on something there that is another consideration. It's worth mentioning. The original project, the Manhattan Project, the crash program to build the weapon as swiftly as possible, which goes into high gear or even overdrive in early 1942. The whole driving idea was that the Germans were working on this kind of a weapon, and we'd better beat them to it, because whoever has the weapon first is going to be in a commanding position to dictate the terms of the conflict's end. So we were originally thought we were in a race with a whole crowd of German scientists, many of whom were known personally and certainly professionally to Oppenheimer and the American scientists or the Allied scientists. Now, it turns out, again, ironically, you can't be a student of history very long without developing a sense of irony. It turns out that the Germans essentially abandoned or backburnered their project at about the same time in early 1942 that the Americans went into high gear, because they thought the technical challenges of developing a deliverable weapon, something that could be carried in an airplane, were just too large to be realistically achievable in the time frame that everybody thought the war would endure. So the Americans go into high gear just when the Germans actually slowed down. But the governing idea was this weapon will be used at the first available opportunity. So there's no reason to believe that Germany could not have been the first target, a German city, had the weapon been developed a little bit earlier, or had the war in Europe gone on a little bit longer. There's every reason to believe that the first bombs might have been dropped on Berlin or Leipzig or you name it.
That was Oppenheimer's understanding. Now let's make one final remark about roads not traveled before I wrap up with you, David M. Kennedy. There was also the idea that maybe there were peace feelers that could have been explored. A Japanese official had been sent to Moscow because after the landings, the U.S. landings on Okinawa, the Japanese government collapsed and a new government comes into power. But these folks were not the militarists who were really driving the train. And the Japanese official sent to Moscow to talk about potential peace, find a way out of the war before any more people had to die, didn't really have the clout. Would you agree with that before I wrap up with you here?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was, mind you, let's remember the Russians were not yet in the war against Japan until the very 11th hour. So they were officially neutral. And you're right, some senior Japanese political leaders, one in particular, went to Moscow to try to feel out the possibility of Russian intervention to mediate a negotiated settlement in the U.S.-Japanese war. But that person was no longer in the government. He had been senior in the government, wasn't any longer. And it was anybody's guess what political weight he actually carried. What influence did he have? So it was clear that there were some people in Japan who were seriously trying to find a way out of the conflict, but what influence they had back home was just not clear at all.
So we'll wrap up David M. Kennedy with really the most important question of all, the most important remark of all. The fire bombings of Japan were horrendous. More than 60 cities destroyed, hundreds of thousands of people killed. But there is a difference. The atomic bomb ushered in a new age. How did its use and the fact that the U.S. was the only power capable of building this at this point portend the arrival of what we call the American century?
You mentioned another important point. The basic scientific knowledge that was necessary to develop a weapon, that was widely understood around the world and by all physicists who worked in this area. But only the United States had the financial, engineering, technical prowess and resources to actually bring it off. So it's testimony to the disproportionate, asymmetrically huge power the United States already had even before the war was concluded. And of course, at the end of the war, as Winston Churchill said in a famous speech in Parliament in August 1945, he said, the United States stand, he used that particular form of the verb, the United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. And the fact that the United States was the only country that had the prospect and the actual achievement of building the bomb is a reminder of just how amazingly disproportionate to everybody else was American power in 1945. The bomb is a very good symbol of that. But you point to another matter that's, again, vexed and difficult and reminds us that history is messy. There was another moment in that the post-war year, 2, 3 maybe, when there were serious proposals floated in this country and elsewhere to develop some kind of a system of international controls on atomic energy, so that atomic energy could be usefully employed for civilian purposes, to generate electricity, for example, which it still does to this day, but to really prevent the development of these gigantic nuclear arsenals that came to be the case in the Cold War. Seems to me that's another story, connected to, but not really driven by the events of August 1945. That's a failure of the post-war generation in this country and elsewhere to really come fully to grips with the horror of weapons of mass destruction on the scale of nuclear arms.
An atomic bomb is not a new conception, a new discovery of reality. It is a very ordinary thing in some ways, compact with much of the science that makes our laboratories and our industry. But it will change men's lives as over the centuries the knowledge of the solar system has changed them. For in a world of atomic weapons, wars will cease. And that is not a small thing. Not small in itself, as the world knows today, perhaps more bitterly than ever before, but perhaps in the end even greater in the alterations, the radical if slow alterations, in the relations between men and between nations and cultures that it implies.
Robert Oppenheimer in November 1945, and you can find that entire speech at C-SPAN's website. And before him, David M. Kennedy of Stanford, an honor to have him back on the show. And as for this matter, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, whether you think the U.S. had no choice but to drop the bomb, or that it could have or should have been avoided, it should always trouble our consciences. 2 airplanes, 2 bombs, an estimated 225,000 people dead, almost all of them civilians, mostly women and children. On the next episode of History as It Happens, Part 3 of the series, Oppenheimer tried to exert his influence to prevent an arms race with the Soviet Union because no one could win a nuclear war. He failed, and a long Cold War ensued. Was a different outcome possible? That's next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive.
Are you driving your car or doing the laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity, like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too.
Having these two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save over $775 on average.
Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com.
Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $779 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2022 and May 2023. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states.